Hello guys, it's good to be back. I'm excited to hop into this lesson today about Daniel. I've really enjoyed studying it and getting to know this passage a little bit better, learning a few more things myself, and I hope it'll be a blessing. It's already been a blessing to me. So we're going to be looking at Daniel's most famous opportunity that he had to stand tall for God. And this will be the last part of this series, stand tall, staying strong through adversity. And we definitely see some adversity in this passage that Daniel's going to go through. And so you already know what it is, Daniel chapter 6, and that's Daniel in the lion's den. And so we're going to hop right in, and I hope that it'll be a blessing. The most amazing part about this event was not the fact that God rescued Daniel from the lions. We can expect God to do something like that. But the fact that Daniel stayed faithful to God despite potentially disastrous outcomes. Daniel didn't know that the end of this story. He didn't have this book about his own life. He didn't know that he was going to survive the lion's den. He didn't grow up on the Daniel and the lion's den story, right? Like we might have, right? But he stayed faithful to God. And that's what we're going to look at today, is Daniel's ability to stay faithful in the face of adversity. So first we see that this faithfulness that Daniel had, it came from a long-term commitment. Daniel was faithful throughout his entire life. First we're going to look at the first part of chapter 6 to set the stage and to see this. It pleased Darius, verse 1, to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give account unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion or fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. So we see here that Daniel is faithful to the king. And in verse 4 it says, For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. This faithfulness was a long-term commitment. He was faithful in the long run. We see in chapter 1 that way before King Darius was even in the picture, Daniel was faithful in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 1, King Nebuchadnezzar offers this meat and the drink to Daniel, and Daniel says, hey, I'm not going to defile myself against God. God has said not to put this meat in front of me, so I'm not going to do it, right? And so he's faithful to God in chapter 1. Then we see in chapter 2 that King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and Daniel, at this time, a little bit later, in chapter 1 he's like 15 or 16. In chapter 2, just a little bit later, he makes it clear to the king that he can't interpret this dream personally, but that God has given him this ability to interpret dreams. So we see that in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel gives credit to God for the interpretation. He's faithful to God. And then we see in chapter 4, which is about 24 years later, that King Nebuchadnezzar has a second dream, and that it had personal implications for the king himself. This is something that this dream wasn't a thing that would be very easy to say to somebody. If you tell somebody, hey, this is going to happen to you, they might get a little defensive about that. We've seen it in the Bible, kings being told this news that they've done some wrong and they're going to be punished for it, and they don't usually respond to that well. It might be something like, okay, yeah, you're dead, bye, right? But we see that Daniel here, He doesn't care. He's faithful. He goes and he tells the king like it is. So number one, he's faithful to God to interpret the dream and to tell him like it is, to be honest, right? If he were to lie, that wouldn't exactly be very faithful to God. But also it wouldn't be faithful to Nebuchadnezzar. He's very faithful to the king and telling him like it is. And that's one thing that a friend can be so good. If a friend is faithful, then they'll tell you like it is. They won't hide anything from you because they want to help you. And we see Daniel right here is faithful. And then about 43 years later, we see Belshazzar. And he is trying to interpret these strange writings on the wall. And Daniel comes in and tells him, and Daniel boldly calls out Belshazzar and his arrogance and his lack for humility before God. And it's the same kind of thing. He's faithful to tell him like it is. And then we see that that same night that Daniel interprets the writing on the wall, King Darius comes in with the Medo-Persian Empire and takes over the Babylonian Empire right here in Daniel chapter 5. And so he's faithful to God when he was a teenager, and then all the way up until we're here finally in chapter 6, he's faithful, and to the point where he's around 80 years old at this point, right? And so he's been faithful his entire life, number one to God and number two to this kingdom. And so we see that these princes, these presidents, that they're trying to get a way to get Daniel out from over the top, because King Darius, he loves Daniel. He wants Daniel to be that number one guy, right? And these princes, they don't like that. They're jealous of it. And so they're thinking, okay, how can we make it where he's below us? And so that's where we see point number two. Faithfulness doesn't prevent or remove conflict. In some areas, it actually brings conflict. These guys, in verse 4, like we've already mentioned, they could find no fault in them, to the point in which they have to say in verse 5, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. We can't figure out any way that he's disobeyed or been unfaithful to this kingdom. And so, but we know he's going to be faithful to his God, so what if we just make them conflict? They're thinking in their minds, if we make a law where Daniel has to either choose to be faithful to the kingdom or faithful to God, he's going to choose God. And we can get him, on that, right? And so we see that this faithfulness, it doesn't prevent or remove conflict. Being faithful to God doesn't mean that you're going to have a life that's easy and full of roses and happiness and butterflies, right? It can bring conflict. Often conflict comes because Satan tries to attack us when we're doing something right for God. And so we see that here for Daniel. So what do? They propose this law in which if anyone makes a petition or prays for the next 30 days, then they'll get thrown in the lion's den. This one-way trip of, hey, you get to go to the lion's den, and you're probably not going to come back from that, right? And so we see that Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den because of his faithfulness. But I want to look at the things that Daniel did in response to this. We see in verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. This is so encouraging. Not only do we see that Daniel continues to pray, but he knew about the decree that said don't pray. He knew that they would throw him in the lion's den if he did this, but he stays faithful to God. He knows exactly why they did it. He knows that they did it for him, so they're going to be watching for him to be faithful to God. So what does he do? First off, not only does he just continue in his prayer, right? But he doesn't hide his faith. Daniel, It says he opens the doors just like he had aforetime, right? Just like he always had done. He opened the doors so that he could be seen. Not that he did it so that he could be seen, but that so he could look to Jerusalem. But it was also in his mind that, hey, people are going to see me doing this, right? People are going to see me being faithful to God. And they could throw me in the lion's den for that, right? If Daniel wanted to be boasting about his faithfulness, then this wouldn't exactly be the smartest time to do that, because it would probably result in being thrown in the lion's den, right? But he opens up the doors to face Jerusalem. And then he prays consistently. He prays 3 times a day, just like he already had. And he gives thanks to God. Can I ask you, how faithful are you in your prayer life? This is something that I've struggled with sometimes in my own life. Are we faithful to pray to God? I think a lot of times it's easy for us. I don't know how many of you are in a public school or Christian school or homeschool or whatever, but I went to a public school, and I know that it was really hard for me when I went and I sat down and I ate lunch with all these other people, and I sat down and I prayed for my food in front of people. It's kind of just a weird thing to do, right? No matter where you're at, if you're in public school, it's not the norm. But to be faithful to God, we ought to give thanks for the things that He's provided for us, right? How faithful are we in our prayer life? Are we so unfaithful in our prayer life that we can't pray and thank God for a meal? Yet we see Daniel here, who's been threatened, and he knows that he'll go to the lion's den if he prays, and he opens up the doors and prays in front of everyone. How faithful are we in our prayer life? How faithful are we in our Bible reading every day? How faithful are we to study the Word of God? Can I ask you, are you consistently faithful? How consistent are you? Next, I want to look at King Darius, what he thought about all of this. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, He will deliver thee. Darius sees Daniel's faith, and he says, hey, that God that you serve, that's been delivering you as continuously as you've been serving Him, He'll deliver you again. Darius recognized Daniel's faithfulness to serve God no matter what. And in turn, he realized that God was faithful. So I want to ask you, just like was asked before, who do you admire or respect? Darius here, you would have said Daniel. Just know that to Daniel, faithfulness was more important than the outcome. And it should be to us as well. Even when you can't control the outcomes, you can be faithful. Your faithfulness is more important than the outcome. I want to look at third, we have faithfulness and God's blessing. Daniel's thrown into the lion's den. Darius held on to a slim hope that Daniel could have survived. So early in the morning, he rushes back and he cries out, and we can look at it in verse 20 here. And he came to the den, and when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. We see that Daniel, because of his faithfulness, God is faithful back to him. Now, does that mean that if God would have allowed the lions to kill Daniel, that God was unfaithful? No. That just would have been the way that God would have made His glory known. God would have worked in some other miraculous way through that. But God decides to work in a miraculous way to save Daniel alive and stay faithful to Daniel, who had stayed faithful to him. Daniel's deliverance was due completely to God's miraculous intervention. Look in verse 22. My God hath sent His angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, and they have not hurt me. For as much as before Him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Daniel's like, hey, God sent down an angel. He shut the lions' mouths because he saw that I was innocent before God and before the king, before you, right? And so I just want to look at what Daniel now, his faithfulness, what that showed to Darius. And so we see the faithfulness and its impact on others. So verses 23 through 28, then was the king exceeding glad for him to command that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no matter of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they did come out of the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reigns of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. We see here that Darius, he sees God's faithfulness through it all. And Darius writes this decree saying, hey, the God of Daniel is God, right? And we see 5 things that Darius outlines about Daniel's God. First, we see that he writes that Daniel's God is living. Unlike all the other gods which are worshipped, the little g gods which are worshipped in the kingdom, Daniel's God is living, right? Daniel's God is steadfast, and his kingdom endures, aka God is faithful, right? And then he also says that Daniel's God is everlasting. Daniel's God is powerful and rescues in miraculous ways. And then lastly, Daniel's God alone is worthy of worship. We should be faithful to Daniel's God. Can I encourage you that your faithfulness to God, one of the greatest impacts it'll have not only on your life, because you will be blessed if you're faithful to God, but also your faithfulness to God can show others his faithfulness, and it can show others to be faithful to God. This is just kind of a God thing that this is the lesson that this morning I'm recording this, and actually a few hours ago I actually just got a phone call from a guy that I was in a teen group with back home in Texas, and he just called me and he just wanted to say thank you for being a faithful friend. And I don't say this to brag, but I say this because he was a faithful friend to me. He had an impact on my life. But he's going through some hard things right now. He's trying to figure out God's will for his life. And he just wanted to call me and he just wanted to say thank you for being a faithful friend. Can I encourage you that your faithfulness will impact others? Not just your faithfulness to God, but also your faithfulness to your friends, right? King Darius saw Daniel's faithfulness. Daniel's faithfulness had an impact on King Darius. And ultimately, it had an impact on the entire kingdom. You think about this. This decree went out to the greatest nation that was on the earth at that time. And what did it stem from? It stemmed from Daniel's faithfulness. It didn't come from just Daniel being so great at doing good things, right? No, it came from Daniel just being willing to be faithful to God. I read this statement. Daniel cared more about staying faithful to God than he did about his own life. Can I ask you, what would you do in this situation? Would you be more faithful to God, or would you care more about your own life? Can I encourage you as we close that the last thing that you could do for your own life is to not be faithful to God? That's the last thing that you would want to do if you respect your own life, right? But the best thing that you can do for your life is to remain faithful to God, regardless of what it seems your life would become because of it. Put your life in God's hands. Those are the safest hands that you'll ever be in. So as we close, I just want to ask you, are you faithful? Would other people call you faithful? Would other people see your life and say, hey, that person's faithful to God, and they're a faithful friend, and I can trust that what they're doing, if I do it myself, God will be faithful to me. So I hope it's been an encouragement to you as it's been to me, and I hope you have a blessed night.